Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you. I'm Sarah Lundberg, as Suzanne said, managing partner of DHR Global's nonprofit practice, and I will be facilitating or leading today's discussion. Whether you're a fundraising leader or board chair, we're really grateful to have you here to listen to and learn from Myrna, Tina, Jethro, and Michelle. Some of the most talented fundraisers in our industry today. I know I'm going to make them all blush by saying that, but it is true. I've known several of them for many years now. They're an extraordinary group. Speaking of leaders in our industry and our industry more broadly, I think we can all agree that we are truly in uncharted territory. As 2024 closed out, headlines spoke to struggles with small and mid-level donors, people worried about making their numbers. As we enter 2025, the ground began shifting under our feet, and I think for many, it feels almost daily. In DHR's nonprofit search practice, we work in service to our industry. We take their commitment to it very seriously. As such, in 2025, in our conversations, we quickly began thinking about how we might help our sector in this challenging time, this difficult time. We've begun with this panel of fundraising leaders, each of whom I hope will inspire you, as they have me, to think a bit more creatively about the times ahead. Before we dive in, I want to thank my co-hosts, DHR nonprofit partners, Michelle Counter and Chris McFeely. Thank you. As well as our DHR Global's nonprofit practice group, our marketing and administrative teams as well here at DHR Global. We're joined today by a phenomenal group of speakers who bring deep experience and fresh perspectives to this work. I won't go through lengthy introductions, but just headline level here. Michelle Walsh, Executive Vice President and Chief Philanthropy Officer at UNICEF USA. Tina Yoon, Director of Philanthropy Consulting at the Nature Conservancy. Jethro Miller, CEO of Jethro Miller and Associates, and as many of you know, former Chief Development Officer at Planned Parenthood Federation. And Myrna Mulholland, Vice President Northeast for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. Thank you all for joining us. I will be guiding today's conversation, which will run for about 45 minutes, give or take. We have a 60-minute window here, but we use 45 minutes to hear the panelists respond to various questions, and then Suzanne Jacobs will be collecting questions, which you can submit through the chat. She'll be collecting questions for us to address around the 45-minute mark. So let's dive in. In 2025, as I said, nonprofits have been grappling with cuts to government funding, volatile market conditions, leaving nonprofits in what I've heard is a near constant state of contingency planning. Michelle, I'd love to start with you. How are these forces showing up in your fundraising efforts right now, if at all?
If at all, definitely showing up. I think you sort of framed it in terms of just the constant state of chaos. I'll just rattle off a few terms that I've heard out there in the wider world. Intense scrutiny, volatile conditions, very noisy environment, a place where information is challenged. Some have referred to an existential crisis for their organizations. And I think what's been really interesting to me is that this is much wider. I think even as I talk to our board members and donors and funders, we're seeing this across the corporate sector, across civil society, all of our partners. So it's almost a broad market condition, let alone what we all know, which is a huge dependency in fundraising, the markets, and a lot of unpredictability in many of those spaces. So I think the theme that we've heard constantly is unpredictability. And then across those, we're all sort of measuring different levers of those other pieces. So maybe I'll just highlight a few, and would love to hear from my colleagues here in terms of what they're seeing. But one is just that it's incredibly noisy in an environment where trust and credibility are increasingly challenged. And again, I don't think that's specific to us or the sector, but it is an existing condition that has really taken off in the past year. So I think of that from two lenses. One is from like the marketing and comm side, which is what are we putting out in market? We've been hearing from most of the marketing experts that we've worked with and on our teams that we're leaning in on tangibility. We're seeing that in terms of what's resonating on click-throughs and response rates, really coming back to core messages and things that feel less abstract and very tangible. We're hearing this similarly in the corporate space, that they're really coming back to a very simple, core, tangible focus. So that's been, I think, how we've really tried to focus in terms of our external messaging. And then on high value, I think it's just a reminder that relationships matter and that it's really important to share what's working, but equally important to share what's not. This need for increased transparency to build trust has been incredibly important. So we just had an issue with a donor report, which I think we've all experienced at some point, and went out straight away, which is always the best practice. But I think we're really trying to ramp up that increased transparency and responsiveness with our existing partners in particular. And then I think the other piece of it is we're seeing from our more sophisticated partners, but even all the way down to donors that are giving $100 or $1,000, that they're rethinking their priorities and narrowing them. So I think that's one where there's also a really significant opportunity here. We've heard a lot of reluctance to be seen as filling the gap. Some of these gaps are so massive, it's almost a joke to think that we will fill them. But I think there's a sentiment of wanting to hear what we're doing differently and how they can be a part of the solution and a new solution, as opposed to just sort of back funding the existing model. So one of the things we did in this space is we did a briefing on the funding cuts, and it was actually one of our best attended offerings that we did as a briefing. And I think we used it as an opportunity to really sell the case for more flexible funding, which is something I think across all of nonprofit, you're pushing for unrestricted and less restricted. It's been a real opportunity to have those conversations. Just in thinking about a specific example around immunizations, right? If you have someone who's willing and interested in procurement, but then there's a shift in the need to shift funding from procurement to service delivery, all of a sudden you're locked in, right, to funding agreements. I think we've all been there. And our funders, I think, are understanding how rapidly, like the uncertainty is now palpable to them as well, changing conditions, changing environment, and we're able to have really good conversations. And we are seeing a push as we train our fundraisers to talk more about flexibility and unrestricted, and seeing some good results there. So those are sort of just three key themes, which is like trust and credibility in a noisy environment, making sure that we're responding as partners are rethinking and narrowing, and also so how we're addressing that. And then we're just seeing collectives, which is, I think, whether it's foundations, which I'm seeing it the most in, they're not wanting to go it alone anymore. And I think, there's some core questions there on whether that's really about risk mitigation or opportunity and sustainability building. But regardless, I think that trend is taking place. And so thinking a little bit about some of the donor collective spaces, that sort of safety in numbers, and seeing that across the nonprofit space as well, that there's a lot better peer sharing out of a sense of urgency. And here we are doing just that. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Tina, I know, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, thanks so much. And Michelle, that was great. I learned something too. So for us at the Nature Conservancy, because of our mission, we are finding that it feels all the more urgent and relevant to people. So there's actually been a lot of interest in our policy work, and this is at the United States federal level and also in other countries around the world, statewide level, local governments. And so there's a lot more interest in that. And so we're leaning into making sure our messages are very clear and offering up exciting giving opportunities for people to invest in that. And we are also reminded that big visions inspire big gifts. So even though there is all this uncertainty, we feel like offering donors an opportunity to make a big difference with their philanthropy can help them to feel like they have a little more control or they're doing something in the midst of all this chaos. And so we are sharing a big global vision. We are a global organization and trying to show how the gifts that they give can have impact that is far reaching, even just beyond their local area. And I think that that has appealed to a lot of people. And then finally, in terms of fundraising strategies, we are working on trying to engage new audiences that we haven't with before. And, we have three main ways we're doing it. We're attracting a broader base through face-to-face fundraising, and that's occurring in a lot of different communities and urban centers in the US and outside the US. And we're engaging in intentional discovery efforts with centers that are centers of wealth that are located all throughout the world and trying to reach into the highest net worth communities there. And we're also setting very clear discovery metrics and um, qualification expectations, and trying to be very clear with our fundraisers about the need to grow our pipeline during this time. And so we're also checking in to make sure that they have the basics of how to do good qualifications. So those are some of the ways in which TNC has responded recently uh, in this world of chaos.
Thanks, Tina. I appreciate that. Jeffrey, I'd love to just call on you if I could. I think you're in, a different position than our other panelists. You're, now a consultant. You were in-house for many years, as we know. You're now consulting and working with, as I understand it, a range of organizations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, what are you hearing and seeing in this space from your clients?
One thing that Michelle said, Sarah, really struck me, which was the challenge or the desire for more unrestricted funding. But I've seen, especially at smaller organizations, how hard that case is to make at a moment of this chaos when there's so much unpredictability. It seems to be pushing donors actually in the other direction in many cases of wanting to be really sure about before they make a gift what it's going to be for, and they're holding back and being uncertain and then making a restricted gift in many instances when that's not what the organization really will benefit from. So I don't know if there are any particular lessons that you've had in terms of working with your staffs and getting them comfortable on having those conversations about unrestricted giving, because I am seeing that as a challenge in smaller organizations that have been more used to relying on restricted giving over the years and haven't had the large pools of lower dollar donors making unrestricted gifts, because we've seen the shrinking number of donors. We've seen more of a reliance on large gifts, but asking for those large unrestricted gifts is really hard, especially for small organizations. Sorry, it's something I've seen a lot of. Some of other people's thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jethro. Our team, it's been a journey, I'll say that. And we were working on this before going probably at least a year ago and starting some of that training. And it's getting fundraisers really comfortable with a few good case studies has been really, really powerful. And having leadership support, right? So that it's not just the fundraiser saying it and then there's a big ask on the table and we have leadership that sort of flips it around on a smaller organization in particular, that you really have to embed it. Otherwise, you're just sort of spinning your wheels. But I think the case studies have been really, really helpful. And we put in place one or two policies that have helped them to sort of anchor it.
I feel like I've also seen an intensification, Sarah, of development leaders being the one making decisions around organizational prioritization, which is happens all the time, even in the best of times. But in a moment like this, where there can be some organizational leadership paralysis or slowness on decision making, at least it can often fall on the development leaders to have to make decisions for the sake of the organization in terms of what the priorities are to be talking to donors about. And that seems to, as I said, become intensified in the last year or so.
Yeah, and our organization has also been focused on raising unrestricted gifts. We have had a tendency for fundraisers to ask, well, which project do you want this for? Let me give you a budget so you can see where your dollars will go. But in fact, if there's a lot of belief and trust in the organization, especially its leadership, there's less of a need to do that. And sometimes some of our best donors or biggest ones, they don't even need anything in writing. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And so we've been having a hard time trying to convince fundraisers that this is a good idea because it's sort of an uncomfortable space. And we've been trying to get them to focus on the outcomes of what work like this project would accomplish. So we're very careful about that kind of language. And then we've also been paying attention to the research or the analysis of the impact of Mackenzie Scott's unrestricted, very large gifts to so many organizations, large and small. And what we've learned is that organizations say that a lot of them have created endowments that will spin off some unrestricted amount, and that's just given them a lot of flexibility and a little bit of comfort. So I think that can be a compelling reason just to have a little more cushion. And that others have invested in capacity building. And so we know that that's another area that's difficult to resource, but can yield dividends long term. And in the world of DAFs, there's been a huge increase in DAF distributions from Fidelity. There's been this research that showed that in 2008, 37% of DAF distributions were unrestricted, but in 2024, so just last year, 64%. So that was almost like a doubling. And so that idea that donors are interested in giving unrestricted gifts is something that our fundraisers are just trying to come to terms with and accept and have the courage to raise money in a different way. And I do recognize that that's quite challenging, but I think if you can be very clear on what is it that your mission is, your vision of the world you're trying to create, and to lean on that and be very clear of the outcomes that the giving will result in, can be successful.
Myrna, if I could call on you, I'd love to hear, I can't tell you how many of my clients will say, if we could just be St. Jude's, and how do we, so I'd love to hear you talk about what you're seeing, and maybe, we're speaking a lot about restricted gifts and maybe larger donors. Maybe you could speak of your mid-level donors and your broader pool. What are you seeing?
Well, I think everyone brought some really, can you hear me okay? I froze for a second. Okay. I agreed with everything that everyone was saying. I think one of the things that we're seeing, yes, I feel very blessed to work for an organization like LSAC St. Jude, and we've been very lucky in many ways. We're an organization that was founded really on the shoulders of our general contributors, and we have a huge mass market program. And that is built considerably over the years, and with that comes a really healthy pipeline. And so but it doesn't mean that we're not seeing any of the other things that everyone's articulating, that you're not seeing a shrinking mass market or donor file, and then the leaning towards, and you're seeing, the concentration of power and where the wealth is sitting, and it's growing, where it's, in the next few years, 40% of it will be sitting with the top 1%. And it's making you really think through your strategies and how am I going to be relevant to the high wealth and the ultra high wealth and so forth. So I think everyone is really kind of looking at the world the same way, is like, how do you go from this place of volume where you will need to continue to build volume and pipeline, but at the same time really drive to value and high wealth. I thought it was interesting, the conversation around restricted to unrestricted, because I know for myself, one of the things that we always lean on is certainly in the work that we do for childhood cancer and other devastating diseases, is the ability to remain nimble and go wherever the science is taking us. And when you restrict, that limits an organization to be able to be extremely nimble. And we need to be nimble when we're actually dealing with cancers and other devastating diseases. So we try to lean on those type of messages, and it has worked, because I think people really want to align to things that are urgent, and research and medical and diseases like cancer, they're constantly shifting, and we need to be able to shift with it.
I love that reframe, Myrna, and I don't think I've heard anyone talk about it in that way. Really, the unrestricted allows you to move fast, to be agile, to do all these things people talk about in the industry and nonprofits needing to be and do, and those unrestricted gifts allowing that and really encouraging it. I'd love to just take a pivot slightly, and look at, what y'all are doing in-house. Like how are you rethinking your fundraising strategies more broadly? What are you most focused on, and how do you anticipate this evolving in 2026? Michelle, maybe you can kick it off. We've had some really interesting conversations in the past about, your shifts in strategy.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that we're doing. So if this moment for us, I think globally UNICEF faced $1.3 billion in government funding cuts, which is not insignificant, and layoffs 25% of staff globally. So really, really big reminder that no funding is guaranteed forever. And it's something we had already started thinking about, but I think have really doubled down, which is like diversification across our streams is really critical. And if we are soft in one space, we need to be able to have stability in order to navigate and build towards long-term growth across all of our various streams. Now that's easier said than done. You're like, great, grow. I mean, I think every development lead gets that. If we've got to grow, we've got to grow. And so I think what we're trying to do is really distribute that across our various channels and audiences, from our monthly donors to our institutional partners to our in-kind partners at hundreds of millions of dollars. And so thinking about that has been a really important piece. The other part is, I think even at the board level, one of the things that we've been really trying to come back to is we have stability here and in some places. So let's make sure that we're not making short-sighted decisions because of an urgent moment. And we want to make smart decisions. We are not, crumbling. There is a lot of chaos, and let's be really clear-eyed about how we proceed. And so making sure that we still are doing that, probably not the 10-year planning, but like that we're doing some mid-term planning and keeping to a 3-year arc and thinking out and making sure that's refreshed annually. So whether that's with our finance committee, our philanthropy and marketing committee, our board chair, our CFO, to make sure that we're continuing to invest in things that will drive that growth is the big core question. And what are we measuring to make sure that we have proof of concept on those things? So I think we're increasing our discipline in measurements and making sure we're still thinking longer term and diversifying. And then the one thing my team asked me, I just had them in person this past week for the first time in a while, and they said, if you had one big bet, what would it be? And we're doing all these things, and it's people. We have a place where trust is a big issue, and we're trying to cut through the noise, and human relationships matter. So whether that's your mid-level or your in-person canvassing or building relationships, like making sure that our people know how to talk about unrestricted. I think it really does come back to team, and it's not just because my team was sitting in front of me, but I think it's that people really do drive, whether our leadership team believes it. I think leadership has an increasing role to build some of that trust, because they really do want to hear consistency across the organization as we build some of that trust and credibility. So that's in a nutshell, but would love to know where others are taking things.
I love that. And Tina, this actually reminds me of two points that you raised in our earlier conversation, right? Really helping individuals across the organization and across TNC understand the importance of KPIs and metrics. And then also really as a group, we talked about keeping people motivated. We'll get to that later, but it's the importance of people. Could you maybe talk a little bit about, the overall strategy, and also, some of the things some of the new practices or ways of doing work that you're trying to bring into the organization?
Yeah, so TNC is a pretty complex organization because we're comprised of business units, and yet we are all one 501c3, and we have one database. But because it grew out of new chapters being formed in local communities, it turned out that we've grown in a way that has been very location specific. And so it's been hard for the organization, or it's been a challenge to institute expectations that can be carried out and maintained and understood at every level of the organization in every corner of the globe. So that is definitely one area that we have recognized is a place that we can grow. We have found there's varying levels of skill, varying levels of documentation, varying levels of, you know, just the way that people do their work. And so we are trying to, from the central office, I am a philanthropy consultant, and all my colleagues are my clients. And so trying to help people understand what is best practice. What are the expectations in the industry? How do we set that up at TNC and make sure our systems can handle managing and tracking that information is really important. And then how do we set what the expectations are, communicate them, and help our colleagues enforce them or like hold people accountable. So surprisingly, we weren't doing this on a consistent basis. But for example, we're having all the fundraisers put in all their activity metrics and such into their annual objectives. And this is something that was sometimes tracked at a team level versus a fundraiser level. So we have differences there, but we're trying to bring it down to the individual fundraiser level. And then we're helping our directors of philanthropy in each of the different business units to understand what are the key things that they need to be paying attention to, and then their conversations with their BU directors, who are like executive directors of each of the business units. What are the key fundraising metrics that they should be paying attention to? So there are multiple levels of accountability, and we have such a complex system with our database and all of our dashboards. There's a huge amount of information that's actually available, but it's kind of at this point, like in some ways it's very easy to use, and then in other ways, if you're not in it all the time, it's hard to remember which view do I go to? What is the standard that I'm trying to hit for my business unit? And what was our goal anyways? All these different things, we have that information. It's a little bit dispersed, so we are working on trying to make it more user friendly, but we are providing very specific guidance on what are the metrics, how do you track them? Where do you find it? What are the expectations? Does everyone have this written down? Are people being, held accountable, but in a way that's not punitive? So we're also trying to bring this culture of accountability that's not punitive so that when people look at their metrics, they look at it with curiosity versus judgment. So we're trying to say, take a look, and if you see this number is lower than you expected, let's think about why. What were some of the specific situations, or are there difficult challenges that we can brainstorm around together? So we are trying to bring that level of curiosity and accountability at the same time across the whole organization.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's a good transition to our next question, which is all focused on data analytics and technology. Throughout my conversations with clients, data and technology are sort of increasingly a part of conversation, wanting to make sure people are staying abreast of the latest trends, understanding how to utilize systems, what they should be evaluating, analyzing. Myrna, I'd love to hear from you first, if you could speak to, any changes that these rapid changes in technology, or this evolution in technology, are bringing to your work.
Yeah, I'll concentrate a little bit more on the front line. Obviously, we have, when you're looking at the portfolio of our fundraising efforts, besides the mass market, we of course have events, and we have our major gift and individual giving work. I think what we're seeing is just this rapid. Obviously, it feels like something new is coming out every single day. And so how do you stay on the front side of that when most nonprofits are usually on the back end, right? But things are evolving so quickly. You have to really be looking at the horizon and trying to ensure that you're staying relevant. So I think there's just that dynamic, which can be challenging. But overall, you're seeing this rapid improvement in technology, and all of it is enhancing not only our efficiencies and how we operate. It's enhancing our reach. It's enhancing the journeys that we give individuals, whether those are mass market or just even individualized journeys. And that's what people are expecting, right? They're expecting to be seen. They want personalized experiences and to know that they're having impact. And so I think technology is helping us improve that and be better at it, whether it's through communication or automated journeys or what have you. I think the biggest impact I'm seeing right now is AI on the front line, right? And I'll give you one concrete example that I learned a lot from, and it was from my frontline staff that were driving events, and how they're leveraging AI. in strategy development and with customized experiences. We had one experience where if I think of building a strategy, say I'm doing a fundraising challenge for my walk or peer-to-peer, and I have different components from what is the strategy itself, what is my communication, what is a social media post, what is this, like that entire strategy development could probably take weeks in the past, right? And a lot of thought. I had a staff member who leveraged AI and in 6 prompts, in 15 minutes, created beginning to end an entire strategy. And it floored me because it's not how I was using AI, but it just shows you the massive impact it can have and how it really does streamline and make our work faster and more efficient, which allows us to dive deeper into direct donor work. She had created a fundraising strategy for our walk, was very specific about the time frame. Then she prompted it to give her a social media post, and then from there make that more concise, and from there create an email for my participants. Then the last one was talking points for our committee when they make calls, and then ultimately an entire calendar. All of that in 15 minutes. So you start taking that learning and you start thinking about how we do that, whether that is in direct donor work or in events, and you start to see the possibilities. It's amazing. I think it's an amazing tool. It'll enhance us and our abilities. But it was just, I was really impressed by it and starting to be a bigger believer in the impact that it can have in frontline fundraising.
I love that example, and I'll just pause for a second and say if anyone else, I want to know if anyone else here has an example like that. If not, we can move on, where you're sort of using it to support, strategy development, donor engagement pathways. If not, we can move on.
We're definitely using it on journey development. That's a great example, and just someone taking some of the initiative. I've definitely had staff members that shared, "Oh, I heard you're paying attention to what's going on in AI." I was like, yes, that's like an understatement, but who said I had it. There was a complicated funding structure that we have, a really significant donor that supported, and fundraisers were trying to fundraise around it and rally. And they were having trouble understanding the financial mechanism aspect of it. And he said, I asked AI to build a podcast for me on the child nutrition fund. And he shared it back with me. It was a 20-minute podcast that I listened to with my husband and sat down, and I think they used it as a tool. Again, it's a reminder that you need validation. You still need the human to help. He still needs to meet with the person and be able to talk. But I think as a sidekick, really, right? Which is like what AI is intended to do most often. It was incredibly powerful to help him understand it. And I thought it was just fascinating how it had humanized, from my own experience, tools that we haven't even really started to explore in how we work with donors. But yep.
Oh, thanks for that. Stepping back to, technology more broadly. Are there other, Jethro, in your work, are you seeing technology and sort of changes in technology influencing your work or your clients' work, since you're working with a range of organizations? I know big and small. Are you seeing any of this or any of the rapid changes in technology changing the work?
I haven't, yet seen the kind of huge impact on frontline. I haven't yet seen the huge impact on frontline. I'd seen a lot of efficiency coming out of the use of AI and technology, and I've sort of, for the most part, been keeping it in that bucket in my mind. But I certainly hear about some organizations who are using it to do direct outreach to mid-level donors and discovery work, and I'm anxious to sort of hear the results of that and think about how that could be applied more broadly without losing the personal touch that we know is so important to fundraising, and especially frontline work.
Thanks for that. Shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to, step into the human side of this and understand how all these factors are impacting talent. Specifically, how are you all as leaders, and I'll kick it off with you, Myrna, if you don't mind, but how are you prioritizing roles or skills within certain subsets of your teams?
Great. No, I think it's a really great question, and I think there's a constant theme you're hearing from all of us. I'll put it simply. I think our focus is, and it's not necessarily an either or, it's certainly an and for us, knowing that we were founded as an organization on mass market, which is more volume, but really building to a value play, really concentrating on the high wealth and really in relational work and direct donor work. So a lot of the shift that you're seeing is ensuring that we're equipping our staff to be intentional about being donor centered and driving and having these one-on-one and really concentrating on the one-on-one. Again, I think what we're seeing in the environment, that a lot of the big dollars are coming from fewer people, and as I said, in the next few years, you're going to see, that top 1% hold 40% of the overall wealth in the US, which tells us that the focus needs to be on relational work and to drive really large gifts. And so that is a lot of what you're seeing at the same exact time with the uncertainty. And Michelle, you talked about the environment we're in. That uncertainty is actually impacting general contributors. So we actually have to monitor that too and figure out, how are they feeling? That hardship, I think, will impact giving, and we will continue to see that. So it's really always keeping a pulse of what you're seeing, but we really are diving and really leaning into the relational work and really trying to rally high wealth.
Perfect, thank you. Michelle, Tina, Jethro, anyone want to jump in?
I mean, I think frontline fundraisers are always at a premium, right, in terms of meeting their expensive for organizations, but worth the investment. So I think, how do you structure your leadership team to allow people to do the frontline work? How do you support them? And I think the thing that becomes hard in a moment like this, from a leader perspective, having been through some times, challenging times before, is how do you retain development staff at a time of organizational cuts, right? Many organizations have had to cut their budgets over the last year, and that often means cuts to staff because we're nonprofits, and for the most part, we succeed and we do our work through staff. And at times like these, organizations are tempted to cut their spending on fundraising, right? And to cut their development teams. And it's very hard for organizational leaders when they're making cuts in other areas of the organization, when they're making program cuts, not to also want to cut into development expense budgets. But of course, you cut development expense budgets, it usually means cutting staff. And that can lead to a downward spiral whereby you're raising less and you're having to make even more just difficult cuts. And so these are some of the most difficult conversations to have around the senior leadership table, especially as a development leader, as you're trying to maintain the size of your team, as you're trying to maintain the organization's investment in development at a time when cuts might be made elsewhere in the organization. And how do you structure your team? How do you look for savings? How do you think about the long-term argument of the investment in development? I think is some of the more difficult people management stuff that leaders are grappling with in moments like this.
I would, Sarah, echo a lot of that. I just was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about we've gone from job hopping to job hugging. I hadn't heard that term until recently, but I think part of it is making sure we have really strong managers who are equipped to do strong performance management. Tina, you were talking about this of like, it's not that it's punitive, but setting expectations and accountability and really managing towards that. And sometimes doing the unfortunate in terms of performance management, for the most part, lifting the entire team up and making sure that our managers are equipped to do that, since we know that retention is less of an issue at this particular moment. But retaining the right people is the important piece. And then when you do have those moments for attracting new talent, I think there is a tepidness of stability, environment, and making sure that we are really transparent about our current state is particularly important as well. So I think that's the piece of it, of making sure we're really driving performance management in a culture that doesn't feel like cutthroat either, right? Because we're all here for a mission that we're trying to drive together.
but how that managers is so important, Michelle, because that's why people stay in jobs or leave
Yes.
jobs because of their managers. At the
Yep.
same time, we have a tendency in fundraising to take our best fundraisers who are amazing individual performers and make them into people managers without giving them the support they need to be successful. It's a totally different skill set to be a
Yes.
successful fundraiser and to be a successful people manager. And we're taking our best money makers and making them into people
Yes.
managers when they're often not good at it. So
That's a great point.
it's
Yeah.
not really the best way to be successful unless you're investing significantly in making them into good, solid managers.
Yeah, agree 100%. I want to just add one other small thing is that I do feel like in this time of uncertainty and perhaps shrinking budgets, that it is actually an opportunity for you as a team to look at, or as a leadership team, to look at how your resources are being allocated, what kinds of functions different people are taking on, and can you try to, in a sense, just make sure you are maximizing the person's interests, strengths, abilities with the areas that your team needs. And are there multiple people doing the same thing? Can that be combined under one person, et cetera? There's a lot of like task switching that can cause a lot of fatigue and slow you down. So that's another thing to consider. And I 100% agree with the thing about not every fundraiser actually wants to be a manager, although they feel like they should because it seems like the next logical step. But I think there could be two tracks. One where you have your superstar fundraisers continuing to get recognition, title changes, increase in salary that doesn't have to be solely tied to management responsibilities.
I'd love to just build on that because we're talking about skills. We talk so much in our work and in our interviews and vetting of candidates about sort of the soft skills, right? And I'd be curious, when you're thinking about building your teams, what are the top qualities right now that you're looking at?
Mm.
When you're building your teams, we use the word agility and a lot in our work. Tell us, what are you looking for when you're building your teams?
Yeah. I will say,
Well, for me,
go ahead.
go ahead,
Tina.
Myrna.
Myrna,
Okay, this is
Yeah,
quick.
it's a great question. I think I'm going to continue with the theme of relational and kind of the value play. I want team members that are incredibly curious, right? Because when you're doing direct donor work, you have to be curious. It's about the donor really understanding their passions, their goals, and how does that align to the mission of the organization. And does it align to the mission of the organization? The other piece, so I would say that would be one quality. The other quality, as I think of, especially in this world where you have so many noble organizations and causes, right? And we're just flooded in the environment. How do you rise above? And that takes a lot of persistence, right? Of really just making sure you're always reaching out, you're giving experiences, you're listening, again, leading with curiosity and so forth. So those are two qualities that I think whenever I see a really strong fundraiser or someone on the front line, those are two things that I can see very clearly in them. And so those are the two I would call out. And there are many more, but those are the first two that come to mind.
I love that. I think if you're determined and curious, there's so much that you can accomplish in this world. Who else?
Oh, I want to piggyback off of the agility piece. I think of it as someone who is not afraid to try new things, that they're not holding on to the old way of doing things. The old ways, there's still a lot of them that work very well, but being open to trying new things and not being intimidated by it. And I think there just has to be a hunger to get things done, like just, okay, there are going to be times where exceptions will need to be made. You might have to work a little bit more, but in general, the idea is how can I get to the result that brings satisfaction and value to both parties involved. So whether it's your donor and your fundraiser, or if it's between team members trying to accomplish a project, to really just have in mind we're all working towards the same goal and let's figure out a way to do it together. And so I think that kind of attitude is also really important.
I think that this ties nicely to my next question, which is Related to the conversation we had several weeks ago, the topic that came up that I think we sat with for a little while is really, how do you maintain morale in this environment? How do you keep people going? And I love that this, you're all in incredibly powerful positions, and this is a real priority for you. So imagine you're thinking a lot about this. How are you in this time of near constant change and uncertainty, sustaining team morale and momentum?
I can maybe give an example. So I decided to bring our full team together in person. I know that, our budgets are stretched, we're hybrid and all that. We reached out actually to airline partners and others to try and do it at cost. We did it on site, squished in a room, but the overwhelming connection to one another and to the mission was incredibly powerful. And you felt like all the people start to get a little ick with one another. It's a little bit tense, and some people are more positive and outgoing than others. But in general, there was like some of that building of like, oh my God, we have to get through end of year and so much ahead. And the entire energy shifted with 2 days together. And so we made a commitment, even for my leadership team, that we were going to come together quarterly and spend half a day and really reground in what makes us a team, how we can support one another, and what our objectives are. And it just changes the dynamic. And so if at all possible, even if you're looking for budgets or grants or other things that support that, I have been pleasantly surprised at how much support we were able to get in order to make that happen. So that's one thing that we just did recently that we are trying to find the right cadence for.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate hearing quarterly. We, as a practice, just gathered in Chicago Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. So
Nice.
and it was really, the energy in the
Built
room.
your bucket.
It builds, yes, it did indeed.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, maybe to piggyback on Michelle's comments, it's about connection, right? I think whether that's connecting as a leadership team, as a full team, people want connection. I think the other piece is people want to be seen. And I try to concentrate on the little things that seem little, but when you actually build them up, they actually become big, right? Whether that can be something as small as someone has a great event and they hit and surpass budget, or they secure a very large gift that I know that they have been working on, and giving kudos along the way because I'm seeing the work and then ultimately recognizing it. I think it's the recognition in the moment that I think people feel, okay, I'm seen, I'm recognized by my leadership. And it's just those things I think that go really far.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm mindful of time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure we give some time for questions. Michelle Counter and Chris very thoughtfully shared a question with us that I'll read out to us all. Thank you, Michelle and Chris. During times of uncertainty, during this period of difficult cuts, how do you express a big vision, right, that gets donors excited when the instinct may be to pull back? But I think you've given examples related to this, across this conversation. But if you had any key take homes, how do you keep people going and inspire when people want to contract? How do you inspire courage to keep moving forward, either internally with your teams or externally with donors? It's a big question. I see Myrna's thinking, so I'm going to go to Michelle, who just took
I
herself.
can share the external. I just talked a little bit about internal, so I'll let someone else touch on that. I think the big piece is really bringing them close to it. I mean, that's donor involvement in general. So, I mean, I feel like co-creation is a word that we throw around all of the time, but really making sure that they're part of the creation so that they're feeling the challenges with you and understand how big it is to really move the needle. I think we did this, as I mentioned, on our child nutrition fund, and we explained the challenge, right? And really brought them along in what that was and understood some of the expertise they had to help not necessarily build the solution, but inform the solution, and then continuing to come back and say, okay, now we had all these funding cuts. It changes the environment. Here's what we're thinking, and bringing them along in that journey with us, as opposed to one big moment where we say like, here's the vision. I do think it has to be tangible and measurable still, like this is the thing, and it has to be very simple and clear. But all of the how is, as we all know, much more complicated and much more sophisticated, certainly when you're looking at things at scale for something big. So bringing them along all those little steps of what the how is, but really keeping it at a very top line of like, this is what it's laddering up to, and making that really clear and measurable, and coming back to it when you feel the weaning, if you will.
I'd say one thing internally is talking to some organizations Sarah is about from the development leaders perspective. They're sort of looking to the organizational leadership to provide that vision for donors, and they're not getting it. And I've been trying to give them the license to develop it themselves, right? It doesn't mean they get the final say, but if it's not happening at the leadership table, if the CEO isn't leading it, if the board isn't leading on it, then I think it sits to the development leaders to say, okay, and put forward something for a conversation, like here's an idea to get folks to react to and provide feedback on, because I think we need that to fundraise on. And if we're not getting it, we got to create it. And we got to have the ability and give ourselves the ability and the license to do that, and not be waiting for anybody else to do it for our organizations.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions I want to make sure we get through on our, our 5 minutes left here. So maybe rapid fire. And I see some familiar names in here. So Chloe, I'm going to jump to your question. And hi, Chloe. What are some of your most actionable and informative KPIs you're looking at in your frontline fundraisers? Maybe rapid fire, 2 or 3 things that come to mind. Tina.
Okay, so what I would say is that you do identify KPIs, which key performance indicators that would indicate progress over a period of time. And these are the things that you're ultimately trying to get to. So let's say raise X millions of dollars. And then you would have metrics along the way, or key milestones that you would have to hit. So for example, if you want to raise a certain amount, you have to have asks 3 times that at least. So seeing that you have that pipeline built up. If you're trying to get folks to focus on the bigger gifts, you might have a metric that would be like X number of solicitations above a certain amount. If you are, and then in terms of just like doing the actual work, how often are you doing the moves, the visits, what percent of your portfolios in which stages and such. There are a lot of smaller things that you could look at on a monthly basis, let's say, to make sure that you're actually doing the activity that will ultimately lead you to your KPI of raising a certain amount of money.
Maybe I'm old fashioned, but I would say one thing that should be on there is in-person visits. I think we've gotten too far away. And look, did I ever think we would solicit 7-figure gifts in a Zoom meeting pre-COVID? I would have said, no, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. And obviously every organization of the big ones on here has done that. But still making sure your fundraisers are getting out and seeing people in person, I think is key. And I'm afraid that's not happening as much as it should be.
No, it's a really great point, and maybe going off of both Tina and Jethro, I think most of us are, to Jethro's point, we're tracking in-person meetings, you're tracking solicitations, you're tracking commitments, and are you closing? I think the one thing I would add that whether I'm here at LSAC or in my previous life, I did see big impact when you actually broaden someone's exposure to the organization. What I mean by that is many of us are one-to-one with our donors. We have our portfolios and we're constantly interacting. But the more I can bring in other leaders and deepen the exposure for that donor or partner, the deeper they're giving. And so that is one other lens to the KPI or the metrics that you're looking at is, can I broaden, bring more in, and in turn deepen the relationship that leads to bigger giving?
That's terrific. Thanks, Myrna. We've probably have time for one more question. I see Julie entered a question here that I think is really important. We've touched on a little bit, but I'd love to just really shine a spotlight on this because it's so important, especially for smaller organizations. How are you adjusting your strategy to reach new funders, particularly as donors maybe narrowing their priorities, and the numbers of priorities and what they're giving?
I don't know that we're adjusting our strategy. I think it's the same basics is right, like who's best aligned, trying to find the best contact to make a warm introduction, doing discovery calls, right? I think it's just appreciating that the networking aspect may be more valuable than before, right? They're receiving an increased volume of outreach as they're narrowing. And so looking for your best contact to make that introduction, whether it's another funder or elsewhere, may be more effective. But I think they're the same 101 of having that conversation and making sure you're not just going to anyone, but like the funders that really are aligned to your mission as well. But I think going deeper with your existing funders is critically important at this moment.
So quality over quantity.
Yeah.
Yeah, retention, right? Retention before reaching out to new people. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, one of the things maybe I'll add is we're thinking of new because there's, if you look at the industry, there used to be tried and true, right, mass market, performance marketing, all of those things. That's even more costly now. So then, so you can look at it that way. That's one way to identify new. You can look at peer-to-peer, and I'm leveraging and I'm bringing in new through other individuals. And some are more cost effective than others. So it also depends on where the organization is, what is the makeup of their programs. And really looking at what makes sense for us as an organization. So I would just say that, it just depends on all of the different programs that you have and what that means for maybe ongoing strategies and the most cost effective. How are we leveraging AI even in that and so forth? So I think there are a lot of angles to this question now, which is not surprising in the environment we're in.
All right, if I'm an indulgence, if everyone's okay on time, I would love to just have a quick answer to this. The last question, which I would just love a quick answer, if you had one piece of advice.
I can chime in here. Know what is that on the NGO piece or so? Oh, sorry, I just saw this in the Q&A. I'll let you go.
Sorry. I was just gonna say one piece of advice for someone looking to build their fundraising strategy. What would it be? Jethro, I'm gonna put you on the hot seat first.
Actually, I would just go where Michelle was ending, which was on retention, right? Like retain and grow your existing donors as your number one strategy.
Michelle, I'm sorry if I talked over you. I think there was a little bit of a glitch there. What were you saying? Do you want to add anything?
Nope. I think it is make sure your fundraisers are well equipped and focus on relationships.
Myrna.
Relationships. I'm going to go right along with them. Relationships.
Tina.
I'm good with that too.
Love it. Keeping it simple today. All right, but simple, but incredibly meaningful. There's so much chatter, and at the end of the day, sometimes the fundamentals are really still, really what you need to pay attention to. So we're right on time. And I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, Tina, Jethro, Michelle, and Myrna. Thank you on behalf of DHR Global's nonprofit practice, my co-hosts, Michelle Counter, partners, Michelle Counter and Chris McFeely. DHR leadership, including our new CEO, Priya Taneja, our incredible marketing team led by Suzanne Jacobs, thank you, and Morgan Phillips. If you have any questions about DHR Global or search work with nonprofits, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Check your inboxes in a week or so for a summary of key findings from this webinar. And thank you.
Great to see everybody. Bye.
Great to see you all. Thanks again.